So what are some of the key themes that we see? Well, human nature. Okay, it all really pretty much revolves, this psychoanalytic theory revolves around his view of what a human being is and what makes us tick. And Freud's writings deal with human nature perhaps more than any other topic. Now, he does deal with religion, but he's explaining religion from the viewpoint of his view of human nature. So, of course, we are full-blown material beings, nothing else. We've evolved from lower animals, just as Darwin said. No questions about that. That's the framework that he's working within. So this is almost like, well, if Darwin's true, well, here's a psychology built upon that. So Freud's view of humanity involves seeing us as a kind of conflicted being. We live with others in society, but we have to sacrifice our animal drives to do this. And we're going to see this come out very clearly in Civilization and Its Discontents. He said that we basically have three parts to our psychic structure, and that's the id, the ego, and the superego. Okay? So each part plays a different role in our psychic makeup. The id is probably the most important part because the id simply means the it, the kind of the it thing, if you will. It's amoral. It's a selfish, pleasure-seeking part of our psyche. It's driven by two chief motivations, or two chief physical drives, and that's sex and violence, or to use the Greek words, eros and thanatos. Now, violence could lead to death. This is the death wish that he will speak of often, but eros and thanatos are the two basic engines driving the id. Now, the ego is the I, and this is, or the me, if you will, and that is what gives us a kind of first-person perspective. The ego must deal with the real world and society. We have to tolerate others. We have to be rational. We have to have control. So the ego is put into, the I is put into a position of controlling those deep, murky, dark forces of the id, of sex and violence. The superego is simply the over-I, or the over-me. And Freud says it is an internalized father figure or an internalized set of cultural rules. It's sometimes simply explained to be our conscience. And it wields not the pleasure principle that the id follows, but it wields the reality principle to compel the ego to constantly rule over the pleasure-principled id and forbidding the id to kind of emerge. And so I usually try to oversimplify this to help people grasp this. I oversimplify it with the classic illustration of a person who's trying to make a decision and make sense out of the world, and sitting on one shoulder is a little devil telling him to just go ahead and give it to them, or just go ahead and do what feels right. Just, you know, kind of follow your urges. And on the other shoulder, there's an angel with a halo, and the angel's telling the person, no, you shouldn't do that. Now, you know, what would your mother think? You know, you can't do that because that's just wrong, and everyone can't do that. You know, and so there's an angel and there's a demon pulling us in different directions. So the demon is obviously, in this oversimplified version, is the id telling us to follow our base drives. The angel, of course, is the superego, or conscience, telling us to do the higher and lofty thing that helps us to get along with everyone else and to think of others before we think of ourselves. Okay? The ego is the person in the middle that has to negotiate between the two. And so the ego is always put in a position of trying to balance out these two forces, if you will, the conscience and the primal drives. So thus human beings are caught between the horns of a dilemma. The inner id wants to follow the pleasure principle. It wants to seek pleasure and to live according to its desires. It wants to let its anger vent. It wants to follow its lustful drives. The superego wants control and sobriety so everyone can live in peace and security. Sex and violence can't be tolerated in social discourse, not without great control. So every society in some way or another comes up with a way to allow those two forces to flourish, but in a highly controlled way, such as marriage. The conflicted ego is caught between these and must negotiate between the two. And the primary way to do this for most individuals is to keep the id bottled up, to keep it put away, to repress the primal drives. And this results in a kind of deep unhappiness, according to Freud, because for him, unhappiness is driven by the inability of the natural instincts of the human being to be able to flourish and to be able to have proper expression. So religion is an illusion that societies use to help the superego triumph over the id. So if we internalize the father figure, we internalize religion, we internalize its rules, we internalize the presence of God, that is always there with us, telling us how to behave and to not follow the pleasure principle. So concerning religion, and Freud said an awful lot about religion. This was one of the major themes running throughout all of his works. Humanity bears a kind of ubiquitous obsession with religion. In other words, it's a universal phenomenon. And since Freud has rejected the existence of God for a purely materialistic universe and humanity, he has to go to some great lengths to explain this universal practice, this universal belief. And so it is with most atheists. Marx had to explain it somehow. Nietzsche does as well. So does Darwin. And so do current present-day atheists. And nearly all of them have a very similar way of explaining it. And it comes down to it's a delusion or an illusion of some sort, okay? But it's used, at least different people see religion being used for different purposes. Freud sees it being used for psychological reasons, to allow civilization to emerge, to give individuals the ability to control those natural urges of the id. So he thinks it is an obsessional neurosis that arose out of something called the Oedipus Complex, out of the relation to our father. And I'm going to explain the Oedipus Complex. This is probably the most controversial part of all of Freud's teachings. But anyway, he says it arises out of the Oedipus Complex. Our God is an illusional father, and so we project God into existence, he says. It's kind of a wish fulfillment. We wish for a loving father who will control and look over us. And so God will complete our wishes, he says. So he thinks that science knows the truth here. Scientific methods alone can give us knowledge. And science says nothing about God's existence, he says. So science is not illusory, so religion must be. Freud says concerning religion, quote, "In our view, the truth of religion may be altogether disregarded. Its doctrines carry with them the stamp of the times in which they originated, the ignorant childhood days of this human race." So he sees faith as a kind of a childish thing. He's saying, grow up. He's squarely inside the Enlightenment stance here that we've looked at before. So he's bought into this Enlightenment view that faith is a weak-minded response to the world, and that, like giving up Santa Claus, you also have to someday grow up and give up God. That's what you have to do to be a full, rational, thinking human being. And so he wants for humanity to give up its weaknesses. His humanist values drive him to attack religion as one of the chief culprits, at least, in civilization's slow progress. And so again, many current-day atheists look at religion in a very similar light and think that the sooner that people give up religion, the sooner we can embrace progress and move on. So after World War I, Freud lost his 23-year-old daughter, Sophie, to a flu epidemic. And 3 years later, Sophie's 4-year-old son died as well. And this was a very, very dark time for Freud. Freud did know a lot of ups and downs in life, not just in loss of family such as this, but professionally as well. And he said, quote, "I know that I have hardly ever loved a human being, certainly never a child as much as I loved him. I find this loss very hard to bear. I don't think I've ever experienced such grief. He meant the future to me, and thus has taken the future away with him. As the deepest of unbelievers, I have no one to accuse, and I know that there is no place where one can lodge an accusation." So Freud believed he was in a godless world, a world, just a pure material universe, in a universe that really doesn't care whether you exist or not. So Freud has nowhere, no one to cry out to. Freud soldiers on in unbelief. Freud knew great pain and suffered great chronic illness himself, the cancer, which was a very painful thing at the time. And he would only try to kill the pain through the use of cocaine, which was common at that time. And so he would eventually become addicted to it and need to use it to kill the pain. And so, like Nietzsche, he was very tenacious, even going through a lot of these very, very difficult times in life. Now let's talk about one other theme, and this is probably the most revolting or even controversial things within Freud, and this is the reason why Freud was often rejected in his own days and called all kinds of bad names, pervert, sex fiend, and so forth and so on. Even to this day, when you discuss these ideas, most students of psychology or the humanities find this to be a revolting idea. But there's no getting around it, okay? It's the Oedipus Complex. You simply do not understand Freud unless you understand this theory. And so, indeed, it is what he's really known for and maligned for and even hated for. And nothing caused quite a stir like the Oedipus Complex. So Freud argued that we are like Oedipus in Sophocles' famous Greek tragedy. In this play, Oedipus tried to run from his fate. When he was a child, there was a prophecy that was given to his father and his mother, Jocasta, and they were told, these were kings and queens of Thebes, and he was told, or they were told, that their son that had just been born would one day kill his father and marry his mother. They thought that this was just a horrific idea, and of course it is. So they decided to expose the baby and let the baby die. And so they give the baby to a shepherd. The shepherd is supposed to take the baby and put it out on the side of a mountain and just let it die from exposure. The shepherd has compassion on the boy and takes him as far away as he possibly can to another land, and finds another shepherd, and he gives the boy to that shepherd and tells him to take him as far away as possible. And so the shepherd does, and he winds up giving the boy Oedipus to another king and queen, and they raise him. Well, as the boy is growing up, he was told the prophecy. Somehow another prophet comes along and tells him, when you grow up and become a young man, you're going to kill your father and you're going to marry your mother. He finds this horrible. He thinks that his current father and mother are the ones that are being referred to. So he runs away. And where does he go? He goes back to Thebes. And unbeknown to him, completely unwittingly, he accidentally stumbles across a man on the way to Thebes who turns out to be his father, and he kills him because they get in an altercation. And then he solves the great riddle of the Sphinx, and because he had done so, the Sphinx was a monster that was threatening the city of Thebes. Because he had done this, and the Sphinx had died because he solved the riddle, the queen of Thebes, who is now a widow, was enthralled with him, Jocasta. Turns out it's his mother. So they get married, and then they have children. And so to every person who's ever read such a story, this is indeed a deep, deep tragedy, and it's a horrific idea. As it was to Oedipus himself when he learned of it, and he stabbed out his eyes because he said, though I have eyes, I cannot see. And so he destroyed his own vision. Freud sees such stories as somehow another indicative of the whole human race. He thinks there's something buried here that tells us something about everyone. And this is the Oedipus Complex. So, as it turns out, Freud says that this tragedy captures a deep truth about all of us. As infants and as children, we want to sexually possess our parent of the opposite sex and to eliminate the parent of the same sex with whom we compete. And so this is the id of the child trying to work out both the principle, the pleasure principle, and the death wish principle, the violence and the sex principle. And so most people find this to be quite revolting. And when Freud came out with these ideas, let's just say that he's lucky in some cases that he didn't lose his life. When the Nazis started burning books, his were the first to be thrown into the fire. And he said, well, it's a good thing because, you know, in the medieval era, they would have just burned me. So a lot of progress had been made. They only burn books now. But lo and behold, he didn't know that the Nazis were capable and would do far more damage to the Jews. But anyway, what he says is that we quickly learn from our parents that this is not permissible, okay? And so this Oedipus complex has to be shut down. And so a child is quickly taught that that is completely inappropriate behavior. And so slowly the child internalizes this social moral code and learns to suppress the id, okay? Now, I've never known anyone who didn't find this theory completely revolting. Freud would say that this very fact that you find it revolting demonstrates something of the truth of it. It demonstrates his point. Then that is that the superego now totally subdues and buries these strong drives within us, which are really just the primal survival instincts. So, in some ways, if Freud had phrased things differently, it might have been accepted a little bit better, but because of, he's talking about these infantile sexual drives and so forth and so on, it became very inappropriate to even almost talk about it. And so, as one thinker said, these are not even appropriate topics for academic discourse. These are, you know, reasons to call the police almost. And so it was just so hideous. But his methodology was to try to uncover deep resentments, animosities, deep passions and struggles that have been long covered up by the superego. In other words, all those issues, as we might call them, have been long repressed and buried. But once they're uncovered, the hope was of psychoanalysis that they could be resolved and one could live without so much neurosis, without so many struggles and issues.